you can really embed these learnings into the rest of your organization. You can engage with stakeholders across risk, finance, strategy, sustainability, product, operations, etc. And all of these risks need to be owned within the organization to make sure that you're actually deriving the benefits of doing this kind of analysis and making your business more climate resilient.
Welcome to the Risk Ready Recipes podcast series, where we serve up insights at the intersection of risk management and insurance in the food and beverage industry. Whether you're a manufacturer, producer, or distributor, our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and tools to navigate risk with confidence, so you can focus on what you do best. Hello and welcome to today's podcast, which focuses on another of the food and beverage industry's biggest challenges, building a strategy for climate resilience, both to protect your business and to unlock future opportunities. I'm your host, Sue Newton, head of WTW's UK Food and Beverage practice, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by my colleagues Jennifer Bonner and Moiz Bohra from our climate risk team. We'll be discussing the biggest climate risk challenges businesses in the sector are facing, and we'll be exploring the practical steps you can take to build resilience. So Jenny, could you start us off, please, giving us an overview of the impact of weather volatility on the food and drink supply chain?
Sure, Sue. So weather volatility, here we're thinking particularly about hazards such as floods, droughts, storms and heat waves. And extreme weather like this can have an impact across the supply chain. Firstly, thinking about agricultural impacts, they can damage crops, so potatoes, tomatoes, combinable crops such as wheat, barley, oats and oilseed rape. They can have an impact on livestock well-being, so thinking about potentially extreme heat and also flooded grazing land, so availability of food. So these can lead to losses and additional input costs. We don't really need to tell anyone about weather volatility as it's been experienced in the here and now. So just to add a bit of context to that, the UK experienced record-breaking rainfall in the autumn of 24, and this disrupted drilling and crop establishment. But that was immediately followed by the driest spring in over 100 years earlier this year. And again, that impacted crop development, especially thinking on wheat, barley and oats. So volatility can disrupt harvest schedules and also transport logistics. It's important to recognise it can be tricky because regional variations both globally and here in the UK can be difficult to plan for. So for example, the southeast of England and Scotland and Northern Ireland within the UK can experience very different weather conditions at the same time. This year, unfortunately, it looks like weather volatility has caused a reduced harvest. We're looking at the fifth worst harvest on record since records began in 84. And since 2000, there have been 3 of the 5 worst cereal crops on record. So I think it's worth noting here that this is starting to hint towards long-term trend changes as well as that volatility piece. So it's important for businesses to look more at chronic changes to climate as well as that immediate volatility that might be experienced. So things like long-term changes in temperature or precipitation regimes, thinking about that kind of warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers that the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change advocate as kind of a main narrative. Weather volatility can directly affect market volatility and trigger price spikes. That's something also to really note the impacts that can be caused. And we saw this in the end of year, December 23. We saw Maris Piper potatoes soaring to 158% increase on that year end. And that was due to very heavy rain in Northern Europe damaging potato fields across Belgium, France and the UK. So just an extra added thing in there is it's crucial to consider that it's not necessarily that there'll be a full harvest failure. It's often the impact of the grade of that harvest that can impact the income of the producer, but it's crucially on supply chains for ongoing production going forward. So I'm sure that lots of us will have seen the latest series of Clarkson's Farm, where his barley didn't make milling grade, so it had to be sold for a fraction of the price to go for animal feed. And this is something that's been seen nationally as well. There has been, I think, a 20% drop in that excellent grade across those combinable crops. So hopefully that's an interesting insight, Sue, into some of the impacts of weather volatility that we're experiencing now and thinking about those long-term trends.
Thanks, Jenny. And I think it's pretty clear that we don't see things improving in the future in terms of the direction of travel.
No, the direction of travel. Unfortunately, extreme weather is projected to become more frequent and severe, and crucially with unpredictable localized impacts. So it is important to consider that weather volatility, but also those more chronic changes that could affect customer demand and also preferences. So thinking if we're going to get more hot weather, how would that affect potentially customer preferences, customer demands? And I think Moiz will speak to this a little bit more on the transition side in a few moments. But also thinking around those customer expectations around sustainability and transparency. These are projected to increase, and obviously that will put pressure on businesses to show that they're doing a real good job of understanding the risk and being able to demonstrate how they're mitigating and adapting to that risk. And crucially, the risk itself is fundamentally financial. So business interruption and also reputational damage can affect businesses' bottom lines. So yeah, it really is important that it's considered.
Moiz, could you talk to us a little bit about how food and beverage businesses are working towards decarbonisation aligned to net zero and where the gaps are, please?
Sure. Thanks, Sue. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. In terms of where the food and beverage sector is today, I think just like a lot of other sectors, we're currently seeing in general perhaps a sort of slowdown or a deprioritizing of the net zero goals. Unfortunately, that's just given sort of regulatory developments, etc., around the world where that might not be as much of a focus, especially given that there are other more pressing concerns that consumers have front of mind, being inflation and the rising price of basic food and beverage goods. Where obviously decarbonization and the net zero goals can help is that there are many places where that might lead to benefits and potential reductions in cost and potential improvements in sort of food security as well. So we can talk a little bit more about that. But essentially, in general, what companies are doing in this sector at the moment is definitely picking the low-hanging fruit, pardon the pun. But essentially, where we are seeing progress is towards greater adoption of renewable energy, for example, where that is available. So even in the UK, for example, renewable costs continue to decline. Companies are able to sign power purchase agreements, get access to that low-cost green energy, which can already have a significant impact on emissions reduction. And at the same time, companies are also starting to invest in a certain amount of decarbonization within their own processes as well. So particularly when you look at food processing, it's still quite an energy-intensive process, which means that any sorts of switch from, let's say, gas to electricity for heating or any other sort of green fuels like biofuels, for example, have the potential to significantly reduce emissions there. The other area where companies have been sort of trying out solutions is around food packaging. Obviously, this has also slowed down perhaps in the last couple of years, but there was a lot of momentum a few years ago to try and reduce the amount of single-use packaging, to try and reduce the amount of fossil fuel-derived plastics, try and switch to more renewable or recyclable materials such as aluminum, paper, bio-based plastics. There's a few different solutions out there. Obviously, it's been a bit harder from a cost point of view to be able to make those switches when those other greener raw materials are a little bit more expensive. And so at the end of the day, inflationary pressures within the wider sort of economy might reduce the incentives for companies to make that switch in a very sort of cost-conscious environment. However, those are the low-hanging fruit where the bigger challenges lie, and as you asked about the gaps towards net zero alignment, agriculture and the sort of associated land use change sector, which is when you, for example, might be converting forests into grazing land for animals, for example, which is obviously not aligned to climate goals. Between the agriculture and that land use change sector, we might be anywhere between a fifth and up to a third of total global emissions. So very, very large contributor and driver of climate change, which means that food and beverage companies have a lot more work that they need to do to make sure that they're not procuring commodities from areas that are at risk of deforestation, making sure they have that visibility upstream within the supply chain. But at the same time, also there's a question around shift in diets as well. So again, this has slowed down in the last couple of years, but essentially there was a lot of interest in plant-based foods as a way to reduce the carbon emissions of the calories we consume. And so the rise in lab-grown proteins, plant-based proteins as an alternative to carbon-intensive meat and dairy is something that is part of that wider sort of decarbonization journey, but obviously leads to a controversial opinion sometimes about whether these diets can be changed and whether people might be willing to do that. So obviously, we don't all need to go vegan. We don't all need to completely switch to plant-based diets, but any sort of reductions in the use of animal-based protein can contribute quite significantly to lowering emissions from agriculture, where obviously methane emissions from cattle are a pretty big source of emissions, but at the same time also reducing that pressure on forests because you no longer need to deforest as much in order to grow soy or to graze cattle, for example. So these are the bigger solutions for decarbonizing this sector, but are perhaps a little bit harder to achieve in the sort of regulatory environment where we are today.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks, Moiz. And in terms of the regulatory reporting requirements that businesses in the sector are subject to, can you tell us a little bit about those and how those are expected to change in the future?
Sure. Switching gears a little bit away from that wider focus on understanding climate risks and transition risks, in terms of what companies are required to do at the moment, they have been for the last couple of years here in the UK, for example, been subject to the TCFD standard. So that's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which requires companies to report qualitatively on their climate-related risks and opportunities. So that tends to be one part of their annual report, or they might have a separate sort of sustainability report. And companies that exceed a certain sort of revenue threshold, so all of the major publicly listed companies are required to sort of report those risks. And that was also implemented as part of UK regulation to even cover companies that might not be publicly listed, but they have to, when they file their accounts at Companies House, to still include that TCFD-aligned risk and opportunity list. Where that is changing over the last couple of years is that we're moving towards further, more international standards. So we have the IFRS, for example, which is the global sort of accounting and financial regulatory body that sets standards for climate-related risks that go a little bit beyond the prescriptions of the TCFD. And these are being increasingly rolled out in jurisdictions around the world. In the UK as well, we expect that to be implemented. It's currently in a consultation process. But we expect an implementation timeline perhaps sometime in the next couple of years. At the same time, we've also got regulatory reporting requirements in Europe as part of the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which requires, again, companies to disclose these climate risks. And that's in a sort of phased process as well, depending on the size of the company, etc., over the next few years. At the same time, there's also requirements in California, which is aligned to the TCFD standard. And given California's size within the US economy, but also in the global economy, any companies that sell products or services in California are required to disclose against that too. So there's a few different standards at varying levels of complexity, and where companies are looking to try to move up that sort of ladder in terms of complexity. They're trying to get to grips around, first of all, understanding what those climate risks and opportunities are, being able to express them as part of a risk register and enterprise risk management framework. But then increasingly, the IFRS and CSRD standards require financial quantification of risks and opportunities. So companies not only have to discuss or disclose in a qualitative way what those risks are, but then try and put some financial figures around whether that'll be a revenue loss or an increase in costs or a CapEx investment needed. The costs that companies are starting to bear as a result of climate change. Those need to be disclosed so that investors have a much more holistic understanding of how climate exposed their investments are going to be.
So I guess at the moment, this is mostly about larger businesses, PLCs and larger businesses, in terms of kind of how those are defined by turnover and number of employees. Is there going to be a move towards the regulations sort of coming down to sort of smaller businesses over time?
Mm-hmm. I think the intention behind the regulation, let's say when they were first being discussed a couple of years ago, was definitely to try and capture more of the sort of share of companies out there. But we have seen in the recent year or two slightly sort of, pulling back of ambition. So the biggest signal has been the CSRD in Europe revising its requirements. So that's been part of the omnibus, which is now sort of progressing through various, levels of European legislation. But essentially what that's done is it's reduced the number of companies that fall within scope. So they've increased the threshold for revenues and number of employees, which means that fewer companies actually have to disclose against the CSRD standard. Now, obviously, where smaller companies might still need to do so, it might be more on a voluntary basis, particularly as the bigger companies that do it may have requirements for their own suppliers, for example, to have a reporting of their climate risks and opportunities. Increasingly, we are seeing that as part of tendering processes, for example, and even the smaller companies within the supply chain have to demonstrate that they've understood the risks. They're making sure that they're taking steps to mitigate for those risks so that they don't pass those extra costs on to their bigger clients and customers.
I guess that's the kind of potential upside, the opportunity side of that really is getting ahead of those requirements in terms of, opportunities to trade with some of these larger customers.
Absolutely. So we're seeing the more engaged that companies are with their climate-related risks and opportunities, they're able to pass those tendering processes, they're able to get their foot in the door. And then obviously there's other decisions that might determine whether they actually win those contracts or not. But having done these climate-related assessments is definitely an important way to start that process. Where there are further benefits to doing this sort of analysis is that the learnings can be quite insightful. So if you know that you are in a flood-prone zone, you need to start taking adaptation decisions, whether that's lower hanging fruit that you might start with and then make the further more capital-intensive investments. You can get a clear plan of action over the next few years as to what you need to do as the risks continue to escalate. At the same time, from the transition point of view as well, these insights can help you understand when to begin looking for new suppliers for lower carbon products and services, what capital investments you might need to make and when, where there might be new opportunities as well. Let's say, for example, from plant-based protein products or any other sort of lower carbon products and services that consumers might be demanding. So it's important to recognize that all of this is not just serving a compliance need. Obviously, you do need to report against any mandatory requirements, but you can really embed these learnings into the rest of your organization. You can engage with stakeholders across risk, finance, strategy, sustainability, product, operations, etc. And all of these risks need to be owned within the organization to make sure that you're actually deriving the benefits of doing this kind of analysis and making your business more climate resilient.
Great, thank you. To finish off, could we have a piece of advice, I guess, from each of you, if you were to sort of focus on either one or a couple of things that you would advise businesses to be doing as we head into 2026, practical measures they can take. Jenny, have you got a view on that, please?
Yeah, sure. So I would just really support what Moiz has just said in terms of the requirements for disclosures, and just to really think about it as more than a tick box exercise, just to think that you're really going to equip yourself with the knowledge to make strategic business decisions in the face of climate change. So the landscape, as Moiz kind of outlined, is quite overwhelming and it's changing at the moment and it can seem quite confusing, but just to encourage businesses to engage in the process because it will be beneficial overall. You'll be more informed on your material risks, so you'll be able to build that resilience and you'll have less exposure through loss or increase in costs. And fundamentally, it'll enable businesses to really have that competitive advantage and keep that reputational advantage as well, both to sustain it, but also thinking about their performance over peers, etc., if others are slower to act. And I guess some tangible actions would be to just go back to what I said before and reflecting on past experiences of weather volatility, thinking about how did that impact your business financially? Can you break that down into component parts? And then look to see how this is projected to change under future climate horizons and scenarios, because understanding that exposure and your current vulnerability will help inform investment in adaptation and mitigation to make you more resilient in the long term.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. And Moiz, last piece of advice from you?
Sure. I think obviously agreeing with everything Jenny said, I'd just like to add that especially for companies in the food and beverage sector, it's really crucial to start engaging with your supply chain. We see a lot of climate risk, obviously, through agricultural commodities and how they might shift in terms of crop suitability in the future, changing weather patterns, etc., can really drive up costs if companies aren't careful about sourcing and procurement in a sort of very strategic way. So if you've not begun that yet, just mapping your supply chain, understanding where obviously your biggest spend might be, but also where your most critical spend might be. You might be purchasing only a couple of £1 million worth of a very specialist specific product that if that supplier goes offline in a climate event might just stop you from making your product entirely. And so having that supply chain mapping, which is obviously already part of risk management processes that companies do, but then making those explicit links with climate change and how those risks might change in the future is really important, because that's how you can then start building resilience through the supply chain as well, which will obviously have advantages for your own business.
Thank you. Thanks very much. So that brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thanks, Jenny and Moiz, for your insights, and to you for joining us today. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening to this podcast from Willis, a WTW business. The information in this podcast is believed to be accurate at the date of publication. This information may have subsequently changed or have been superseded and should not be relied upon to be accurate or suitable after this date. This podcast offers a general overview of its subject matter. It does not necessarily address every aspect of its subject or every product available in the market. It is not intended to be and should not be used to replace specific advice relating to individual situations. We do not offer, and this should not be taken as legal, accounting, or tax advice. If you intend to take action or make any decision on the basis of the content of this publication, you should first seek specific advice from an appropriate professional. Some of the information in this publication may be compiled from third-party sources we consider to be reliable. However, we do not guarantee and are not responsible for the accuracy of such. The views expressed are not necessarily those of Willis Towers Watson. For further authorization and regulatory details about our Willis Towers Watson legal entities operating in your country, please refer to our Willis Towers Watson website. It is a regulatory requirement for us to consider our local licensing requirements.